Research notes. Towards the forging of a Chinese university. Ethos, zendan and fudan, 1903–1919. Ruth Heiho. Fudan is one of China's few universities to survive the vicissitudes of this century's political upheavals, with a tradition of almost 80 years standing. Many of the colleges which sprung up at the same time perished with the 1911 revolution, and others of similar character disappeared in the reorganization of Chinese higher education in 1952. It may be significant, therefore, that Fudan was chosen by Chinese communist leaders to become one of the main comprehensive universities for South China in 1952, which suggests that certain aspects of the tradition for which it was known were considered acceptable and worthy of continuation under the new people's government. Perhaps its development had demonstrated some small measure of success in the exacting task facing Chinese higher education in this century, that of creating a modern Chinese-style university on the ruins of the traditional education system whose values persisted in spite of the abolition of the imperial examinations in 1905, the year in which Fudan was born. The use of Western terminology such as university, college or academy to describe Chinese educational institutions, especially those of traditional China, makes one immediately aware of the vast cultural gap between these two highly developed yet very different educational traditions. Translating the Chinese scholarly titles of Jinshi, Juren, and Zaihoki by doctorate, master and bachelor degrees, as is sometimes done, demonstrates even more vividly the incompatibility of the two traditions. No wonder then it has proved difficult, if not impossible, for Chinese educators in this century to adapt a Western model of the university to the Chinese situation. Y.C. Wang in his Chinese Intellectuals and the West argues cogently that the role into which Chinese intellectuals cast themselves within the modern universities of the nationalist period was one important factor in the collapse of the nationalist regime. The upheavals within Chinese universities during the Cultural Revolution added a further reminder that Chinese socialist leaders, having drawn upon a Soviet-style university structure, had not solved this deep-rooted problem. Now that Chinese leaders are again looking to the Western university as an exemplar, it may be of interest to look back to one example of the contradictions that arose in the early part of the century between Chinese and Western traditions of higher education. Chinese higher education in the early 20th century. By the turn of the century, Chinese leaders had finally awakened fully to the pressing need of absorbing as much Western learning as possible in order to revitalize the nation, a goal perceived as necessary for national salvation. Higher education was seen by many as fundamental to this task, an emphasis that is not surprising in the light of the Chinese traditional focus on educating an elite scholar class for the bureaucracy, and in light of the pressing nature of the challenges they faced, which seemed to leave little time for broader and more comprehensive educational development. Although the first plan for an overall education system was adopted by the Qing government in 1902, very little was done at the central government level to implement it, and most popular education was left in the hands of enlightened gentry, men such as Zhang Jian, who saw the importance of starting from the grassroots and educating teachers for primary schools so that standards overall could be raised. In the higher educational institutions which proliferated during this period, several different streams or styles can be identified. The Qing government was proceeding cautiously with modern schools in which Western languages, sciences, and even social sciences were being taught within the framework of Chinese traditional philosophy, the superior essence of which was unquestioned and which was to shape Western techniques for the service of China. Thus the Beiyang Gongxu, founded in 1895, Nanyang Gongxu founded in 1896, and the Imperial University, later by Da, founded in 1898, all went beyond the earlier modern schools' focus on languages and military sciences. In some ways the discipline Indiana these schools was extremely lax, as many of the students were there simply to enjoy government stipends and wait for their chance to enter the official service, while it was strict in other ways, in that political activism was forbidden and wide-ranging reading and discussion of Western philosophical and political writing was seen as potentially dangerous. The conflict which broke out at Nanyang Gongxu in 1902 illustrates the type of situation which attracted the most creative and energetic of the students to the revolutionary cause. The students were forbidden to read Rousseau and Liang Qiqiao's Renovation of the People. In protest against this and other disciplinary measures, over 100 students left the school, accompanied by Cai Yunpi, who was teaching there at the time. 6. He and some of the radical students went on to form the Patriotic School, Aguo Sushi, in the same year, while others of the group were instrumental in the founding of Zendan, Aurora, the following year. The authorities responded by transforming Nanyang Gongsu into a commercial college of the first class under the Ministry of Commerce in 1905. 7. An alternative to this government-style higher education was offered by Protestant missionaries, whose colleges had been developing since about 1860, and by the turn of the century some of them were making a significant contribution to the introduction of Western science and culture to China. With some misgivings, yet feeling that no other option was available, the missionaries consciously shaped their institutional style after the Western pattern that was familiar to them, in many cases the American Liberal Arts College. 8. Thus St. John's University in Shanghai, run by American Episcopalians, was proud that by 1905 its academic standards were equal to those of American colleges and its graduates could study in the United States for higher degrees. 9. This compensated for the fact that its degrees were not recognized by the Chinese government at that time, nor did it have any Chinese registration, only its charter with the American state government, where it was registered. Although there was a sincere desire to serve China through the education provided in these colleges, little attempt was made in this early period to adapt either the administrative style or the curriculum to the Chinese situation. 10. A third quite different response to the educational needs of the period set itself consciously against both the traditionalism of the government modern schools and the foreignness of the missionary schools. These were the revolutionary schools, founded often as a front to disguise revolutionary activities, yet also having a significant educational function. The patriotic school set up by Cai Yunpi under the auspices of the Chinese Educational Society in 1902 might be seen as typical of these schools. It is not surprising that military training and intense discussions of immediate political issues formed the main, though by no means the only, curricular items. The school was governed by a form of representative student government, and, because of the constant shortage of funds, the teachers were mainly patriotic scholars who gave their time voluntarily. Financial support for the school was gained by students contributing to the radical journal Suibao. The combination of intensive political activity and the continual threat of closure by the Qing government made it impossible for these schools to sustain an academic program in either Western or Chinese studies. Such schools were more a loosely organized scholarly political society than a college in the Western sense. A fourth type of higher school was established by reform-minded gentry who were very active in setting up private and public, as distinct from government, schools in this period. Many of them were constitutionalists and their desire to preserve Chinese classical teaching within the curriculum differed from the true conservatives in that it was more a conscious expression of nationalism than an unquestioning acceptance of the absolute authority of the classical teachings. 12. The distinguished Chinese scholar and diplomat Ma Xiangbo falls clearly into this group, yet in his founding of Zendan in 1903, elements of both the missionary tradition and the revolutionary school style can be seen. Deeply influenced by his own rigorous French Jesuit education, 13. He saw the need for continuity and some distance from immediate social and political issues, thus he turned to the Jesuits for aid in his project. Rather than establish a private college with his own considerable property and funds, he turned these over to the Jesuits as an endowment so the school could benefit from their educational expertise and the long-standing tradition which they represented. L4. At the same time, disappointed by the failure of many of his ventures as a consultant in government modernization projects, he had come to the conclusion that until the closed-door mentality had been destroyed and some democratic foundations laid, there was no hope for China. 15. He was therefore very sympathetic to revolutionary activists, and quite prepared to offer them sanctuary within the school, although this was in direct contradiction to the Jesuit tradition. I will look briefly at Ma's own educational experience as a background to the analysis of the conflict between him and the Jesuits which led to the birth of Fudan in 1905. Ma Xiangbo, his educational background. Ma was born into a family that had been Catholic since the days of the 16th century Jesuit, Matteo Ricci. Brought up in a deeply rooted independent Catholic tradition, he was also thoroughly educated in the Chinese classics in his early childhood. At the age of 11 in 1851 he left his birthplace of Dantou, Jiangsu province, and made the long journey to Shanghai in search of a Western education. He was accepted for study at Le College Saint Ignace, Suigongxiu, established by the Jesuits the previous year. 16 After only 2 years at the school, he was giving classes in Chinese classics as well as studying Latin, mathematics and French. In 1862 he became a member of the first class in the newly established Jesuit seminary under the Italian Jesuit Zottoli. He spent his first 2 years in spiritual exercises and practical parish work, then from 1864 to 65 immersed himself in studies of Chinese literature and Latin. During these 2 years he developed ideas that he was to use later in organizing a curriculum for both Chinese classics and European literature. 17 The following 3 years were devoted to studies in mathematics, philosophy, and natural sciences, which led to a doctorate degree in 1870 and his acceptance into the Jesuit order. In 1872, when he became principal of Le College Saint Ignace, he made a point of emphasizing Chinese traditional studies, demanding of the students high standards in the classics before they studied Western subjects, and even encouraging some to prepare for the imperial examinations. In addition to teaching and administration, he embarked on a program of translating many Western works on mathematics and astronomy into Chinese, and he also wrote articles on comparative Chinese and Western mathematics. The Western priests disliked his emphasis on Chinese studies in the school and accused him of encouraging the religious aspect of Confucian ceremonies, although throughout his life he firmly denied any support to the development of Confucianism as a religion. Nevertheless, he was relieved of his post as principal in 1875 and transferred to the recently established observatory, where he did what he could to promote astronomical research in spite of inadequate instruments. He also devoted himself to studies in comparative mathematics. However, neither the textbook he translated, Shulia de Quan, nor his own prolific papers on comparative mathematics were published by the Jesuit press, no doubt partly because there was no one with the necessary level of scholarship to assess them. 18 Deeply frustrated by this, and under strong pressure from his brothers, who were involved in various government modernization projects, Ma finally left the order in 1876. His younger brother, Ma Jianzhong, had studied in the École Libre des Sciences Politiques in Paris, and was the first Chinese to have been awarded the French baccalaureate degree. When he returned to China in 1878, the two brothers discussed at length plans for a training institute which would select the most talented young people and give them a thorough grounding in Western culture over a period of 3 years, with a few of the best being prepared for important diplomatic posts or further study in Paris. 19 However, this project did not materialize at the time. Rather, Ma became involved in various modernization projects, first as an advisor to a machine factory, then a mining works in Shandong, later as a consultant on foreign affairs in both Japan and Korea. In 1884–85 he worked with the China Navigation Company in South China and also visited Taiwan and made suggestions for economic development there. In 1885 during a trip to the United States and Europe, which proved abortive because the Qing government refused to accept the loan he negotiated for steel mills, he had the opportunity of observing at first hand both American and European universities. He was intrigued by the difference between the continuing emphasis on classical languages and culture at Oxford and Cambridge and the greater, practical emphasis and attention to science in American universities. 20 Although Ma continued to work somewhat half-heartedly on various modernization projects, he had become totally disillusioned with the Qing government by this time, and with the collapse of the 1898 reform, which he had supported, he withdrew to Sujiahui to take up a life with the Jesuits again. 21 He had married in 1876 and had 2 children, the third dying with his wife in a boating accident in the early 1880s, so he could not re-enter the order, but the Jesuits treated this aspect of his life as if it had never happened. His official Catholic biography and all other Catholic publications never mention his family. 22 Meanwhile he was being drawn back to his religious roots, and in the reform movement he had discussed with Liang Kikao the idea of founding a school for translators in Shanghai, and had approached the Jesuits for their assistance. 23 The donation of all his family property to the Jesuits may be seen as an attempt on his part to take up again his priestly vows of poverty. It was during these years of retirement that the project of founding a new-style Chinese university that would keep pace with Western universities came to fruition. 24 For Ma it came about in response to the demands of young intellectuals with whom he was in contact. It also fulfilled a dream he had harbored for many years of being able to introduce advanced levels of Western learning to Chinese intellectuals. From the point of view of the Jesuit fathers, the vision was somewhat different. They had seen the progress of Protestant missions, especially American, in higher education, and they longed to see a proportionate Catholic influence. 25 They wanted to demonstrate that the Catholic faith was totally compatible with the highest intellectual endeavors, and revive the traditions of the 16th and 17th century Jesuits. 26 They were convinced of the superior nature of French educational traditions, and were willing to work in close cooperation with the French government on this project. With such differing motivations, it is not surprising that conflicts soon arose between Ma and the Jesuits. The founding of zendan, 1903. The founding of zendan was closely linked to the student storm at Nanyang Gongsu referred to above. In the same year, 1902, while Ma was living in quiet seclusion in Sujiahui, Caiunpi, and some of his students in the special class at Nanyang asked him to teach them Latin. They wanted to come at 5 a.m., the only space they could fit into their schedules, but Ma said it was impossible, that was his time for prayer. He also argued against teaching them Latin on the grounds that his observation of American and European higher education showed that Latin was no longer important. However, his own fascination with Western classical culture meant that he was easily persuaded by Cai's reply that he needed Latin in order to get to the roots of Western thought. An informal study group of about 24 young intellectuals was started, needless to say meeting at a more civilized time than 5 a.m., focusing on Latin, philosophy, mathematics, and French, an entirely predictable curriculum in light of Ma's own educational background. 27 With the outbreak of the student rebellion at Nanyang, Cai and some of the students organized the Patriotic School, while others persuaded Ma to set up a more formal school along the lines of his vision of a new-style Chinese university. The three underlying principles on which the school would be based were, to place a priority on science, to emphasize both Chinese and Western culture, and to avoid religious disputes. 28 The curriculum was advertised in the journals in Mindanao, and attracted young intellectuals from all over the country, including traditional scholars and revolutionaries. 29 The curriculum was organized by Ma into 4 sections which reflected both the emphases of his own French Jesuit education, and his desire to put Western knowledge into a Chinese framework. The first category was language and literature, and here Ma had a carefully worked out scheme for building up knowledge of Chinese classical literature, as well as an approach to European literature which began with Latin as the basis, building upon that French and English and their respective literary developments. 30 Together with his brother, Ma produced a pioneering work on applying Western grammatical categories to the analysis of classical Chinese, entitled Mashi Wen Tong, which was published in 1900, and was used as a reader in the early years of zendan and fudan. 31 Ma also wished to emphasize the importance of translating Western works into Chinese. The second section, philosophy, was given the traditional Chinese designations Hizi Shuet, rather than the moderns Higzu, and again Ma himself provided a text with his Hizi Qianchuo, a simple introduction to philosophy, which introduced mainly Western scholastic philosophy. 32 The third section was mathematics, a field in which Ma himself was well versed through his own translations and comparative analyses of Western and Chinese mathematics. Finally, the fourth section, natural science, designated as Zhuoshui in the traditional Chinese phraseology, probably included astronomy and meteorology, as the new school was housed temporarily in the Jesuit observatory at Sujiahui. In addition to these academic subjects, Ma was in agreement with the revolutionary schools in their emphasis on military training and discussion of contemporary political issues. The teaching style was informal and personal, reflecting the informal relationship he had with the first group of 24 students, although by 1905 there were already about 100 students. 33 Ma encouraged independent study and tried to direct the students towards carrying out their own research. The lecture method of teaching never played much part in traditional Chinese education, and it seems it was slow to find its way into Chinese modern schools. Cai Yunpi, teaching at Nanyang, asked the students to read for themselves in a chosen discipline, then write a notebook on their findings, which he would read and comment on. It seems likely that Ma used a similar style, having the students read and then bring what they had learned to class for discussion and criticism. 34 Training in oratory was also considered important, and Sundays were given over to debates and speeches given by students on contemporary issues. Here an interesting marriage between a Jesuit emphasis on cultivating excellence of expression and the desire of Chinese intellectuals to be able to express their political convictions effectively can be seen. The administrative style reflected Ma's belief that the university should be a place where democratic principles could be put into practice. All administrative work was undertaken by students, although Ma himself held the position of principal. Each term there was an election in which different students were chosen to be on the administrative committee. 35 This arrangement, similar to that of the revolutionary schools, may reflect the tradition of the Chinese Shuyuan, which was much closer to a scholarly society than a college in the Western sense. 36 Ma's great admiration for the French idea of the academy, whose function is rather the recognition, reward, and encouragement of scholarship than the teaching process, may suggest that in this institution Chinese and Western traditions are more able to harmonize than in the university. 37 Ma was flexible about the selection of students. He wished to accept students from all backgrounds and convictions, and was eager to help mature students who wished to gain an understanding of Western thought. In order that no student should be hindered by financial considerations, Ma had funded the school generously so that food, clothing, books, and all necessities could be provided free of charge, a particular boon for those students who were in trouble because of their revolutionary activities. The most famous of these was Yu Yuran, who was accepted into Zendan under an assumed name to avoid arrest by the Qing government for having written a poem satirizing the Qing administration. 38 This financial provision paralleled that provided in government institutions at the time, and by no means guaranteed attracting good students. Rather, the quality of the students who gathered in the first 2 years of Zendan's existence should be accredited to Ma's own scholarly achievements, which made him something like the distinguished Shanzhong of a traditional Shuyuan. From Zendan to fudan, the split between Ma and the Jesuits. From the beginning Ma had wished the Jesuits to be involved in the new school, particularly because of his respect for their teaching qualities. However, their involvement created tensions which by 1905 led to an open break. In March of that year, while Ma was briefly absent due to illness, the Jesuits seized the opportunity to introduce changes which suited their educational principles and their aspirations for the new school. The issues of disagreement were the curriculum, the administrative style, and the selection of students. They felt the curriculum was far too broad and ambitious. They wanted to bring order to the chaos by imposing the French curriculum as it had been adapted to their colleges in Europe. Also, they wanted to ensure that the French language took precedence over the English, which the students preferred. 39 They felt the French curriculum would give respectability to the school and bring it up to the standards of French higher education. Another advantage in using the French language and curriculum was that it made the content of education more remote from the burning national issues of the day, issues with which Ma had encouraged the students to become conversant. Secondly, the Jesuits had an entirely different idea of the role of the students from Ma. They disagreed with student government, and in Ma's absence arranged for one of their number to become sous-directeur, with 2 priests and 4 scholastics to help him in administrative work. 40. The school's constitution was changed accordingly. 41. Student government officers were ignored, an important factor in the students' decision to leave in protest. The third issue was also related to student life, the question of student involvement in revolutionary activities. Ma was quite willing to accept and protect revolutionaries, although he wanted the school to be more than a front for their activities. The Jesuits, however, were strongly opposed to this and threatened to call the police from the French concession to arrest any student who took part in activities inimical to the Qing government. As there were a significant number of such activists in the student body, Ma had little choice but to resign and leave with the students in protest against this interference in their freedom. The question of student age was also related to this issue, as Ma welcomed mature students, while the Jesuits preferred younger students who were more pliable. 42. The departure of Ma and the students from zendan in March 1905 received some attention from the Shanghai press, which naturally took the Chinese side in the dispute. 43. The students were determined to reopen zendan and develop it along the lines on which it had been started, but the most pressing problem was a school site and finance, as Ma's initial endowment was now in the hands of the Jesuits. The students and Ma made use of their connections with provincial gentry and officials from Jiangsu and Zhejiang, and were given a temporary site in Wusong by the provincial governor, Zhou Fu, together with a subsidy of 20,000 yuan from provincial funds. 44. However, by the time they were ready to reopen in the autumn of 1905, the Jesuits had already reopened zendan, so that this name, chosen and valued by the students to such an extent that in their departure they took the school signpost, was now lost to them. They chose to call the new school fudan, a second or revived Aurora. The rest of this article will trace briefly the development of these two schools, zendan and fudan, up to the May 4 movement of 1919. Noting the distinctive elements of Chinese tradition which fudan students and teachers brought to the forging of fudan's intellectual tradition in contrast to zendan, which always prided itself on being a French university in China. Zendan, 1905–1919, a French university in China. The goals which the Jesuit fathers set for l'Aurore when it reopened in the autumn of 1905 were unequivocal. They wished to provide secondary and higher education to young Chinese equivalent to what they would be able to get in Europe, so that Chinese students could have the benefits of a European education on native soil. 45. Some of their publications betray concern, not without reason, that many of the young Chinese in France either gave themselves up to a life of pleasure or became infected with atheistic, socialist, or revolutionary ideas. 46. To use their own words, la formation de l'Aurore est attachée à créer une élite digne de son R61 et de classe dirigeante, pentri des vérités morales et sociales, une élite auxiliary des saints ayant perdu, au contact de la religion catholique, ses préjugés contre elle, et papriciant dans le desarroi actuel. 47. In the light of these goals, there was no hesitation in setting up a curriculum modeled on the French one. 48. By 1908 they had organized a 3-year cours préparatoire, in which the French language was used as the medium of teaching in all but the first year, and students were prepared for an examination equivalent to the French baccalaureate, covering the following subject areas: French, English, European literature, history and geography of China and the West, philosophy, mathematics, physics, and natural sciences. The cours supérieur also covered a 3-year period, and was divided into 2 sections, one leading to a licence es lettres, and the other to a licence es sciences, with appropriate subjects being followed in each section. 49. By 1908 there were about 242 students following these courses. 50. In 1914 the curriculum was further developed towards the goal of providing professional training, not surprising in view of the excellence of the French higher education tradition in this area. The cours préparatoire remained largely the same, but the cours supérieur was now divided into 3 faculties: lettres droit, science and medicine. The first offered a 4-year training in general arts and law, followed by examinations for the licence es lettres, and the option of a 5th year to write a doctoral thesis. The Faculty of Science gave a 3-year program in general science leading to a certificate in mathematics, physics, and chemistry, followed by 2 years training in specific fields of engineering leading to professional certification. Finally, medicine offered a 6-year program leading to a specialist certificate in anatomy, embryology, physiology, and histology, with 1 further year and a half for certificates in external pathology, obstetrics, surgery, and internal pathology. The various examinations leading to certification in all these areas were set under supervision of the French legation and also the Chinese government to ensure standards acceptable to both sides. 51. The teaching style seems to have been a typical European one, emphasizing lectures, laboratory work and guided research, with instruction being carried out in the French language. Between 1909 and 1924 about 1,500 students passed through these courses, but only 100 graduated, of whom the Jesuits reported that 60 were holding important professional or official positions by 1924. 52. As far as school administration was concerned, the academic aspects were totally in the hands of the Jesuits, although the staff included some Marists, also French lay professionals particularly in the field of engineering, and a growing corps of Chinese teachers. 53. In the early years at least, student life was regulated under the supervision of a number of Chinese gentry who supported the school, and who had as their representative overseeing the student hostels a Chinese priest, Le Père Laurent Li. 54. It seems in this the Jesuits had wisely recognized the difficulty of disciplining volatile Chinese students during these years of political upheaval, and tried to have the Chinese exercise their own style of discipline over the education of their youth. However, with the outbreak of the May 4 movement in 1919, the underlying principle of Jesuit control over student discipline manifested itself. Zendan students were involved at an early stage of the movement in Shanghai, but took a fairly moderate line, at first arguing against the proposal for a general strike. However, under the influence of more radical student leaders, they soon came round to supporting the strike, and organized the 200-strong student body very effectively, without gaining permission from Jesuit authorities. On discovery of the student organization work and plans, the Jesuit response was predictable. Dans Pinteret de l'Aurore, d'un de la Chine elle-même. On ne pouvait ainsi admettre une aurore dans l'aurore. Tu fallait à tout prix sauver l'autorité. 55. On May 28 the students were issued an ultimatum: either they should return to their classes and prepare for their examinations, or leave the school by noon of that day if they intended to continue participating in the movement, with the option of returning and taking their examinations in September. 69 of the 200 students elected to stay parce qu'ils comprennent que le premier devoir d'un citoyen est de se former, afin de s'imposer plus tard par sa science, sa loyauté, son dévouement des intérêts. As the Fathers recorded. Approvingly. 56. The rest took an active part in the movement. What was most resented by the radical students was that the Jesuits called the police of the French concession to see that their departure took place in an orderly fashion. It remains to make an assessment of the educational value of this particular experiment in adapting the French higher education ethos to China. On the positive side, l'Aurore had a committed professional body of teachers, highly experienced in educational work, able to provide both administrative continuity and effective professional training. This may have been of special importance to China in this period as an example of a type of educational institution which simply did not exist in traditional China, where the teacher qua teacher had a relatively low social status, and the scholar had to demonstrate his scholarship in the exercise of broad social and political responsibilities. The standards set by l'Aurore in medical training were respected from a fairly early period. Engineering also established a good reputation, and by the late 1930s and 1940s law graduates were playing an important part in the legal system of the Kuomintang government. 57. On the negative side, there was an extreme authoritarianism which was greatly resented by the Chinese, especially when, in the 1920s, the issue of foreign educational control became a heated one. Although Chinese were given titular positions of authority on the board of managers and staff, the Jesuits continued to hold the reins of power. Chinese accounts of Zendan also express a strong resentment against the Jesuit leadership for its determination to suppress all political dissent, and remain on good terms with the authorities, whether they be the Qing government, the warlord regime, the Kuomintang, or even the puppet government of Shanghai under the Japanese. 58. Education and politics were to be kept completely separate, and the Jesuits could see no educational value in student political involvement. The attempt to set high standards of professionalism, equivalent to those of France, meant that the training provided was not always suited to the needs of the Chinese situation, and an increasing number of graduates set their sights on going abroad. Also, it is somewhat surprising, with the research capability of the Jesuit community, their renowned library at Sujiahui, their observatory and natural history museum, that high-level scientific research was not integrated into the teaching functions of the university, at least in the early years. This no doubt reflects the French tradition of separating professional training from research. Although Jesuit research into aspects of Chinese culture and natural history was quite highly developed, the curriculum of L'Aurore remained strongly French, and there is little evidence of a contribution to the task of providing university-level teaching materials in Chinese in these years. Fudan, 1905–1919, towards the forging of a Chinese university ethos. Fudan's early goals also focused on an elite, and the original intention was to provide access to contemporary modern knowledge for Chinese scholars. 59. The concept of contemporary modern knowledge was reinterpreted over the years according to the practical realities of China's development. Also, there was a trend for young students who did not have much Chinese scholarship to attend the school. Fudan's development from 1905 to 1919 is more difficult to trace than that of zendan, in the absence of any documentary material except brief school histories and the memoirs of alumni from that period. Certain things are clear, however. One is that Fudan's existence and development depended entirely on the efforts of students, mainly the group who left zendan and who felt a continuing loyalty to the school's cause. Some of these had connections with local officials, and so they were able to use the dilapidated government offices in Wusong and obtain a subsidy from the governor of Jiangsu and Zhejiang. It was at the invitation of the students that Ma took up the principalship from 1905 to 1906, after which his involvement in the constitutional movement drew him away from the school. 60. In the subsequent years, the principal, or superintendent as the office was called under the contemporary system, changed each year: Yanfu in 1907, Xiaojingguan in 1908, and Gao Fengqian in 1909, then Ma again in 1910. Thus, there was no continuity of leadership or scholarly input, a natural situation in light of the fact that all of these were men of affairs rather than professional educators, a new breed that was almost unknown in China at this time. 61. How then did the school survive? The work of the students was clearly decisive. In addition to their looking after all the administration, some of them also taught, for example, Shao Litsi and Jin Tong Ai. Another important factor was the appointment of Li Denghui as Dean of Studies in 1905, who continued as principal from 1913 to 1935. Li was an overseas Chinese, born in Indonesia and educated at Yale University, where he graduated in 1899. He was one of the early American returned professional educators to take a lead in China's development of higher education. As an overseas Chinese, he had no immediate political or social responsibilities and so was free to devote himself entirely to educational work, bringing to the task a strong spirit of patriotism. 62. In the first 2 years, the curriculum was organized into 2 sections, French and English, with the main subjects in French being taught by Ma and those in English by Li. However, French was soon dropped as a medium of instruction, and a rough distinction was made between arts and sciences in the 4 college years, which were supposed to follow 5 preparatory years. The main subject areas listed in an early account were Chinese classics, politics and law, arts, commerce, natural science, engineering and agriculture, with some pride being taken in the fact that all the following subjects were offered at one time or another: Latin, English, German, French, psychology, accounting, mathematics, surveying, physics, chemistry, Chinese art, geology, mining, astronomy, analytical chemistry and mechanics. 63. It seems unlikely that serious work was done in many of these fields, however, particularly in the sciences, as there appeared to be no teaching staff qualified to give the courses. Probably the teaching was somewhat ad hoc and informal, with classes being given by whoever was available in areas of their own expertise. In any case, by 1907 there were about 200 students, attracted by the quality of the teaching, according to one account, and by 1911 there were 57 graduates. Among the students were two famous translators, Li Qinjie and Zhang Yu, two disciples of the great Chinese scholar, Zhang Taiyan, Wang Dong, and Qian Jingyu, an outstanding historian, Chen Yingqi, leading journalists, Wang Wuji and Xiao Litzi, and political leaders such as Yu Yuan and Wang Jingui. 64 These results in themselves suggest the nature of the curriculum strengths, language and social sciences, reflecting Ma's early ambition of providing a school for translators and diplomats. In the 1911 revolution the Wusong site was lost and the school had to be closed temporarily. Its revival in 1912 was again due to the efforts of students, who used their connections with Kuomintang leaders to gain help from the Nanjing temporary government in 1912. Through Cai Yunpi, Minister of Education, they were granted a valuable site in Suzhihui, the ancestral temple of Li Hongzhang, which had been built in his honor by Sheng Xianhui. 65 They were also given a subsidy of 10,000 yuan from the new government. A board of managers was set up, chaired first by Wang Konghui, who also acted as vice principal of Fudan, and subsequently by Tang Sheiyi. The years from 1913 to 1917 were difficult ones, as Fudan gained no further government subsidy, and some of those who had supported her originally left the country during Yuan Shikai's regime. It is difficult to ascertain what sort of teaching went on during these years, but the fact that the first graduating class in arts completed their studies in 1919 and the first one in commerce in 1921, with a count of 62 graduates in all between 1912 and 1921 suggests the nature of the curriculum and also the fact that Fudan suffered from the same problem as Zendan in these years, a somewhat volatile student body, with large numbers dropping out before completing their studies. An arts student who entered in 1919 remembers having taken courses in psychology, sociology, civics, European history, philosophy, and English literature, all taught in English with American textbooks, in addition to Chinese literature and history, which was a requirement for students in all three sections, arts, commerce, and science. 66 The nature of the teaching staff during these years is also significant. Many of them were men of affairs, some closely connected with the Kuomintang, who gave some of their time to teaching. Wang Konghui was both vice principal and professor of law, logic, and political science. Xiao Litzi was an instructor in Chinese literature, history, ethics, and philosophy, and Ye Chukang an instructor in Chinese literature, geography, ethics, and philosophy. 67 Of the professional educators, Li Denghui continued as the pillar, functioning both as principal and professor of philosophy, psychology, French, and English. Jin Tong'ai, later Dean of Science and Engineering, was also beginning a career of full-time involvement in Fudan's development. By 1919 the student body had reached about 400, with at least half of these in the preparatory section, now called Fudan Middle School as distinct from the university, a status which Fudan had taken upon itself in 1917 when its name was changed from Fudan Gongxiu to Fudan Dixu. If the teaching and learning process was somewhat informal and ad hoc, the student body was highly organized in other ways. The student self-governing organization had a senate and an executive branch, Ping'ai Bulletin and Zhixing Bulletin, and the students even established their own law court for settling disputes among themselves. By 1918 the students had set up their first voluntary primary school for the children of workers, which they staffed themselves. In the same year they also organized a cooperative bank and store, which they saw as a kind of economic experiment in cooperative theory. Their weekly journal Pingmin's Hukan, which ran to nearly 200 issues, was an attempt to spread the principles of the cooperative movement among a wider public. 68 The students were also responsible for Fudan's first research journal, started in 1915, taken up as a semi-annual in 1918 and a quarterly in 1921. It introduced natural and social science theory from the West, contained articles of local social investigation, and also was a forum for the new literature. 69. In light of this integration of social and political involvement with the learning process, a phenomenon that has deep roots in Chinese educational tradition, it is not surprising that fudan students emerged as leaders of the May 4th movement in Shanghai. There is a dramatic story of how Xiao Litzi rushed out of his office at the newspaper Mingguo Ribao to the Fudan campus in the early hours of May 5 after he had received the news of the outbreak of the student protest movement in Beijing. He rang the bell and called all the students from their beds to the dining hall, the former temple of Li Hongzhang, where they discussed their response to the call from Beijing and made plans for rousing the whole student population of Shanghai to action. 70. One might be forgiven for wondering whether Li Hongzhang turned over in his grave. Subsequently, fudan students played a leading role in the movement, with the fudan student, He Baoran, as the first head of the Shanghai Students' Union, and several others also in leading positions. The students were fully supported by fudan staff in their involvement in the movement, and many meetings were held on the fudan campus, a strong contrast to schools such as zendan and St. John's which had expelled their student agitators. 71. It remains to make a brief comparison between this new Chinese higher education ethos which was being forged by fudan students and teachers and the consciously French ethos fostered in Pierrora. While student numbers were about the same in the two schools over the years, academic standards, if measured by Western canons, were clearly lower at fudan. Also, professional training was slower to develop, and when it did in the 1920s as a response to pressing needs, the focus was on different fields: teaching, journalism, commerce, and engineering. 72. Of necessity, fudan's early courses depended heavily on Western language texts, as did zendan's, but by the 1920s a few fudan teachers were pioneering the writing of Chinese texts for college use in such fields as economics, commerce, and psychology. 73. Another important development was in the field of Chinese literature, where Chen Wangdao applied Western rhetorical theory to the analysis of Chinese literature. 74. An innovation which might be seen to follow the precedent set by Ma's Mashi Wentong. While fudan was not known either for its achievement of, or even aspirations after, Western academic standards, in a small way it took upon itself the important task of adapting the new knowledge to Chinese realities. In the early years at least, political involvement was looked upon as a natural part of the learning process. Fudan's radicalism even made a contribution to the strengthening of her academic standards, as the May 4th movement brought to fudan a number of talented students who had been expelled from missionary and government schools, 75, and two teachers, Chen Wangdao and Lu Dabai, who made a valuable contribution to the struggling university. One of the great weaknesses which fudan shared with many similar schools was the lack of any tenure system for teachers, which meant there was a continual turnover of staff, and many teachers were working in several institutions at once, being paid by the hour. In fudan's case it was her old students, both those who came back to teach and those who were members of the board of managers, whose loyalty provided some measure of continuity in teaching and administration over the years. To leave the last word to a Chinese intellectual, who graduated from fudan in 1919, and came back as vice principal in the 1930s, the fudan spirit was one of creativity, bringing new things to life out of nothingness, the forward-looking spirit of a pioneer, a spirit of exalting the Chinese nation and race, and finally a spirit of self-sacrifice. 76.